Welcome to This Opinion Will Expire. Today we'll be diving into one of the topics that some of our smartest thinkers get wrong, using an episode of the Cosmic Skeptic. I've chosen Matt Dillahunty as our subject, not because I have something against him, but actually quite the opposite, because in my opinion, he's one of our brightest modern-day philosophers and ethicists, specifically on theology and secular humanism. The topic we'll be examining is veganism. And if you follow Matt Dillahunty, you know he's been hounded at times for leaving this topic largely untouched. In his defense, being that theism or atheism is his primary subject, it's reasonable that he wouldn't spend too much time on veganism. To his credit, Matt Dillahunty does a very good job of sticking to the subjects in which he's most well-versed. However, as Alex O'Connor, host of the Cosmic Skeptic, argues in the discussion we're about to watch, any ethicist and secular humanist should strive to have something thoughtful to say on the topic of veganism as well. Though the full conversation lasts over an hour, we'll be focusing on three short parts, three highlights, where I think the very smart, considerate mind of Matt Dillahunty lets himself slip into some poor arguments against veganism. I'll argue that he falls into these arguments not because he's unintelligent, but because for those who eat animal products, conceding ground on the topic of veganism is to admit that we should change one of the most important, substantial parts of who we are, what we eat, and the enjoyment of eating. On that note, let's get into the first clip.
I'm under the impression, you said many times that like your aim, your goal almost, I see it almost as like a motto of what you do is to know as many true things as possible.
And as few false things.
Right. Now, equally, you think that morality lives within the realm of objectivity and truth. And so it seems to follow...
Sure.
That,
well, moral valuations.
Yeah, so it seems to follow that if it's true that that killing and eating animals for food is immoral, then you want to know it.
Yes.
Right? So let's unpack this. Firstly, I agree with everything you've said. Like, for instance, the ability to go vegan on a practical level is not available to everybody. And secondly, you don't need to be opposed necessarily. I mean, it's a gray area for me, but you don't need to be opposed to all ways in which animals are killed, just the horrendous forms in which they're killed.
Sure.
But given that, you live in a city, you live in an area where it's perfectly possible to go vegan, and equally, 99% of all of the animals that end up on the plates of Americans comes from factory farming.
Yep.
So even with the caveat of saying I'm not necessarily against all forms of animal slaughter, and even with the caveat of saying there are certain people who can't go vegan, well, those don't apply to you. So why bring them up when talking about, like, for instance, why you're not a vegan? Why bring up those considerations when those don't apply to you?
Well, it's a direct response to a specific simplistic challenge that I've been presented with on the show. But it's not a response to the whole issue at all.
Yeah. So the reason that I think it's important to think about this is because if it is true, for instance, that it's impossible to go vegan in certain areas of the world or even areas of the country, then perhaps it would make sense to suggest that if people who could go vegan went vegan, that would send shockwaves throughout the country such that eventually the areas which currently now cannot go vegan will be able to in the future. And the only way that's going to happen is if people like ourselves, who are in a position where we can do so, take it upon ourselves to make that change.
Sure. But I think that argument could be used for any number of things without... That is an argument for change that eliminates some of the objections to objections. But when it comes to the morality of it, with regard to my view, which is about whether or not whether there's something necessarily immoral about eating meat, I don't know how I could be convinced of that.
The end of this clip is telling. The conversation had narrowed to the question of whether Dillahunty might have an obligation to modify his diet, even though not everyone can. Dillahunty seems to recognize he can't easily sidestep the suggestion that he avoid factory-farmed animals, so he returns to contending with the broader claim that eating meat in every case is immoral. On a different topic, within his wheelhouse, I think Dillahunty would have quickly snuffed out and extinguished such an invasion. But perhaps, because he's strongly motivated not to concede ground, he avoids his potential obligation to stop at least factory farmed meat, and instead stays comfortably in the realm of this general claim that eating meat isn't always immoral for every single human being on our planet. Let's head to the next clip.
Jumped into another realm.
The reason I ask is because the agricultural industry is the single biggest contributor to climate change.
Yes.
Far more than travel and things like that, all put together.
Now, to be fair, before I go down this road, this is something that I haven't spent much time in, but have been told about, and I'm fine with. However, is it the case that we couldn't make improvements such that those industries are no longer major contributing factors to climate change, and yet still have those industries?
And not practically, no. Especially because a lot of the emissions come from the animals themselves. So
those animals aren't going to go away when we stop eating them?
Well, no, yes, they are. I mean, once the demand so there are currently unthinkable numbers of animals that are specifically being bred to be tortured and slaughtered. If the demand goes down, then they simply just won't be born anymore. And so the animals aren't going to go extinct.
So maybe the better solution is to do like a Thanos snap and eliminate half the human beings. Because now that fundamentally changes.
Well,
I realize I'm half smiling and I'm not trying to be glib.
Yeah, that's not frivolous. But the reason why I wouldn't accept an argument like that is because the whole context in which we're talking about this, and the reason I brought it up is because you said a second ago, when you're making the choice about whether to eat meat and stuff, you say, well, how is it that going vegan is going to affect human beings and my welfare? Well, obviously, getting rid of half of the population, or even just solving the overpopulation crisis, let's say, is not like, if you just kill half of the people on the planet, that's not good for human well-being.
See, and I'm not convinced we have an overpopulation crisis.
Okay, but even if we don't, you could say that one way to combat climate change would be to cut the population in half. Well, sure, another way to combat climate change would be to stop driving cars. But an even better way than both of those things probably put together is to stop eating meat. And in fact, I think the single biggest thing that you can do as an individual to combat your personal ecological footprint is to stop eating meat.
When Dillahunty says those animals aren't going to go away when we stop eating them, I think he's willfully ignoring the fundamentals of economics. When animal products demand goes down, the corporations who supplies those products stop breeding those animals. Over generations, the factory farm version of these animals will wane, which is ultimately good for humans and the planet generally. Dillahunty follows with a somewhat flippant comment about getting rid of half the population instead of eliminating a handful of factory farmed animals for our diet. I'm not sure this comment needs to be addressed, but of course, we can avoid eliminating half of humanity by simply growing and eating more efficient sources of energy. Let's go into the final clip.
I also would say that my moral contract is reciprocal. So I don't think a shark is immoral for trying to eat me, and therefore I'm not completely sure how it could be immoral for me to eat a shark.
It's probably not immoral for a lion to rape you.
Yeah.
But it would probably be immoral if you went and raped an animal. I'm not sure.
I'm opposed to it. I'm not necessarily sure that I have particularly good reasons for it.
There's a problem with having a view of ethics which says that I only have an ethical obligation towards you if you have the same ethical obligation towards me.
Why?
For instance, I have ethical obligations towards children. You can see the relationship between children and adults.
Yeah, but children become adults. Cows don't. They don't become people.
Well, that why should that matter in that instance? Because so would you say, for instance, a child becomes an adult? Does that mean they become someone who has moral virtue, or do they have the moral virtue already?
I think this is another case of Dillahunty avoiding the moral position when he knows better. I only have an ethical obligation toward you if you have the same ethical obligation toward me is a slippery argument. Conscious states matter. A lion is unlikely conscious of itself, and therefore cannot make moral determinations. It can't determine the rightness or wrongness of eating someone, or in Alex's example, raping someone. By the same token, A person with a mental disability whose consciousness has been hindered may also be unable to reciprocate another person's moral obligations. But that does not mean we shouldn't act at the ceiling of our own moral consciousness. I think more broadly speaking, this conversation between Dillahunty and the Cosmic Skeptic reminds us to ask ourselves, what's motivating our arguments? What are the benefits of believing what we now believe? What do we stand to lose if we change a certain belief? What might we have to admit to ourselves for the sake of a new moral consistency revealed to us? I, of course, am also plagued with moral inconsistencies and ethical nearsightedness. I'm plagued with opinions that I wear loosely because I like the way they look on me. And I avoid the important opinions that, if worn properly, would weigh me down with the raw necessity of action. Even this opinion, right here, right now, may soon expire.